They laughed at the old man who walked with a limp and leaned on a worn wooden cane, until a Marine colonel stopped, stood at attention, and gave him the kind of salute reserved for heroes. In that moment, everyone around fell silent, because the man they had dismissed was someone they could never become. What happened next would change how they saw everything and everyone. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. On a quiet Tuesday morning, the town of Millersford buzzed with its usual pace, orderly, polite, and predictable. Downtown bustled with café chatter and the occasional honk from a delivery truck, and the sun spilled over the cobblestone sidewalks that still gave the place its postcard charm. Among the polished shoes of businessmen, strollers pushed by mothers, and shiny leather boots of passing officers from the local base, shuffled a pair of battered sneakers held together with duct tape. They belonged to a stooped man in a dark green field jacket that looked like it had seen better decades, his slow steps aided by a cane that clicked steadily on the bricks beneath him. His name was Walter Harlan, and no one paid him much attention, except perhaps to raise an eyebrow or exchange a smirk when he passed. He was always alone, his gait uneven, his face weathered like driftwood beaten by time. At 76, Walter didn't look like much. His beard was gray and patchy, his eyes a dull blue that seemed to scan the ground rather than meet people. He would visit the park at the center of town, sit on the same bench near the war memorial, and feed crumbs to birds from a paper bag he kept in his jacket pocket. Most days, kids avoided the bench and adults averted their gaze. The teenagers from the nearby prep school sometimes whispered jokes when they passed him. One even called him the town raccoon once, because of the way he rifled through trash bins on recycling days. Walter never reacted. He seemed more like a fixture of the town than a man, like an old statue no one cared to learn the name of. What no one noticed, or perhaps chose not to notice, was how Walter always stopped near the entrance of the base when the morning flag was raised. He would stand at a rigid angle, silent, his hand trembling slightly as it hovered near his brow, a salute almost. But no one paid him any mind. That morning in particular, the dismissal reached a new low. A group of junior officers in pressed fatigues stood outside the local diner, sipping coffee and laughing loud enough to draw glances. One of them, a lieutenant with sharp creases in his uniform and sharper sarcasm in his tone, elbowed his buddy as Walter passed. "Check it out," he said under his breath, but not quiet enough. "Old war reenactments in town early." Laughter followed, not cruel in intent perhaps, but dismissive, arrogant. He heard it. He always heard it. He paused mid-step, his cane steadying him. For a second, it seemed like he might say something. His head lifted slightly, just enough for the early morning sun to hit his cheek and reveal the faint outline of a long, curved scar running down the side of his neck. But instead of responding, he simply nodded once, almost to himself, and kept walking. Inside the diner, a different kind of hush fell. Betty, who had been working the counter since 1982, watched the scene through the window and sighed. She had served Walter coffee every Thursday for nearly a decade. He never said much, just nodded in thanks and always left a crumpled dollar more than the bill. She knew there was more to him, though she never pried. Outside, the lieutenant laughed again. "Can't believe someone like that's allowed to roam around base property. You'd think security would keep the place clean." No one challenged him. Not yet. But something in the air shifted, barely perceptible. Later that afternoon, Walter made his way back to the park, as he always did. He took his time, his cane tapping in rhythm with the slow beats of his memory. When he passed the bronze war memorial, an 8-foot statue of a young Marine mid-charge, he slowed, stood tall, or as tall as he could manage, and then he whispered. Just one word. "Charlie." He sat again on his usual bench, feeding pigeons like always, until the sound of boots filled the path behind him. Not fast, not aggressive, just firm, sure steps, the kind that meant business. He didn't turn. The man approaching wore a full-dress Marine Corps uniform, ribbons and medals gleaming under the late-day sun. A silver eagle pin marked him as a colonel. He walked with quiet dignity, eyes locked on the man with the cane. The same colonel who had spent the morning at a high-level security meeting. The same colonel who, when shown an old photo for base commemorative records, had paused and said just one thing. That's Harlan. In the middle of the town, in the full view of the same lieutenant and officers from that morning, Colonel Daniel R. McKenney walked up to the bench, removed his cover, stood at attention, and gave Walter Harlan a crisp, unwavering salute. Every sound in the park fell away. And for the first time in over 40 years, Walter Harlan returned the salute. His hand, though trembling, moved with precision, the kind they didn't teach anymore. No one laughed after that. But the story was just beginning. The sun had dipped just enough to cast long shadows across the manicured lawns of Millersford Veterans Park, where Walter Harlan had just raised his hand in return salute. The silence was absolute. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath as the Marine colonel's posture slowly relaxed. Daniel R. McKenney, decorated and disciplined, a man known for his hardened stare and unshakable composure, stood a full second longer before dropping his salute. And then, without a word, he placed a hand gently on Walter's shoulder, nodded once, and walked away. No announcement, no speech. But for everyone who had seen it, it was as if time had split into before and after. The young lieutenant from earlier that morning had turned pale, the grin wiped from his face like chalk in rain. The other officers stood frozen, their eyes darting between Walter and the colonel's retreating figure, unsure what they'd just witnessed, but understanding instinctively that it was something monumental. For a man like Colonel McKenney to render a salute to a civilian, an elderly man with a cane and a forgotten face, meant that they had misjudged something profound. But while their realization had only just begun, the weight of it had lived inside Walter Harlan for decades. As the colonel disappeared beyond the tree line and the park slowly resumed its quiet hum, Walter remained on the bench. He didn't smile, nor did he bask in the attention now thick in the air. He simply looked down at the crumbs in his lap, brushed them away, and adjusted the angle of his cane before rising once more to his feet. He made no dramatic exit, just the same shuffling pace, the steady rhythm of his cane tapping like a metronome through memory and pain. He passed by the bronze memorial again, this time pausing to place his hand on the base, where the engraved names glinted faintly in the amber light. His fingers traced one name in particular, calloused skin brushing over the grooves with reverence. Charles M. Keating. No one knew what that name meant to him. No one asked. They only knew now that the man they had scoffed at was someone who earned respect in the language that required no words. News spread quickly. Millersford wasn't a place where secrets lived long. Within an hour, Betty at the diner had retold the entire event to 3 regulars and the delivery driver. By dinner time, the story had been picked up in a local veterans Facebook group. Comments flooded in, people asking who was Walter Harlan, and what did the colonel know that we didn't? Theories bounced around like pinballs. Retired general, secret intelligence, Medal of Honor recipient. None were correct. Walter didn't return to the park the next morning, nor the next. For a man of habit, this was unusual, and it didn't go unnoticed. By the 3rd day, people began asking questions. Betty, unable to shake the image of Walter sitting alone with breadcrumbs on his coat, walked over to the small apartment complex off 8th Street where he was rumored to live. She had never been there herself, but she'd overheard him once mention the building's number when his wallet fell open on the counter. The complex was old and unimpressive, the kind of place where the paint peeled in strips and the buzzers hadn't worked properly since the Bush administration. She knocked twice, then a 3rd time. No answer. She hesitated, unsure if she was overstepping, but something compelled her. She called out softly, "Walter?" Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel.
It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Still nothing. She turned to leave, but the door creaked open an inch. A voice from within, rough like gravel, but calm, said, "Come in, if you don't mind stepping over history." Inside, Betty found herself in a room that smelled faintly of coffee and liniment. Every wall was covered with books, faded maps, old photographs, and dusty plaques. One wall, almost entirely devoted to black and white images, caught her attention immediately. She saw Walter there, younger by decades, standing in front of a chopper in jungle fatigues, his face half hidden behind aviator glasses. "I didn't mean to intrude," she said gently. "You weren't at the park. Folks were wondering if you were all right." Walter looked up from his worn recliner, a cup of black coffee in hand. "Just felt it was time to sit with ghosts a while. Can't feed birds every day, you know?" She smiled, unsure how to respond. Then, carefully she asked, "That colonel, he knew you, didn't he?" Walter stared into his coffee for a long while before answering. "He didn't know me. He knew what I was, what we were. Me, Charlie, and the rest of the boys from Echo Company." She sat down across from him, her heart pounding now with the realization that the stories on the wall weren't just stories, they were history. "We were inserted in Laos in '69, supposed to be a recon op. It turned into something else. Something no one talks about. Not even the colonel. But he was a green lieutenant then. He saw things, and I saw to it he lived to tell the tale." He took a long sip of coffee. "The cane? That's from shrapnel. The spine was never quite the same. The limp? From running through triple canopy jungle carrying 2 men on my back while napalm dropped behind me. I never told anyone because no one ever asked." Betty's throat tightened. "You never told anyone?" Walter shook his head slowly. "Didn't need to. Not until the salute." And with that, he returned his gaze to the photograph on the wall, a younger him standing next to a man whose name most had forgotten, except Walter, and now, perhaps, the town would remember too. But this was only the beginning of the town's reckoning. The cane they had mocked was only the first artifact of a much deeper story, one filled with brotherhood, betrayal, sacrifice, and a truth buried under years of silence. The kind of truth that, once unearthed, refuses to be ignored. 3 days after the salute, the war memorial in Millersford stood a little taller, not because the bronze statue had changed, but because people now walked past it with different eyes. Children no longer ran by without a glance. Adults no longer used the bench beside it as a spot to check emails or sip lattes distractedly. It had become a place of curiosity, almost reverence, simply because one old man with a cane had been saluted like a legend. And though no plaque bore his name, his silent presence now lingered like an invisible shadow over the town's consciousness. At the local base, the ripple turned into a wave. Colonel McKinney had not spoken about the event publicly, but those who worked closest to him noticed a change. A file had been pulled from the archives, an old, nearly forgotten personnel dossier marked Echo 4/restricted. McKinney had gone through it with the intensity of a man trying to unbury something sacred. Inside it were names long since faded from memory, some crossed out in red, some marked as MIA, others simply labeled classified engagement, no further detail. Among those names was Walter J. Harlan, Sergeant First Class, Recon Specialist, U.S. Army Special Operations, 5th SFG. The file had a note, final commendation submitted but unprocessed due to mission sensitivity. It had been buried under layers of bureaucratic tape, never followed through, forgotten by the system, but not by the men who served with him. Colonel McKinney closed the file and pressed his fingers to the bridge of his nose. He had been a second lieutenant then, barely out of Quantico, still polishing his boots every night out of habit. He remembered Laos, not in vivid color, but in sharp smells and sounds. The heat, the endless canopy, the whisper of movement through tall grass. He remembered being pinned under a collapsed tree after an ambush, his radio smashed, his leg broken. He remembered the sound of mortars and the sickening silence that followed. And then he remembered Walter, a silhouette against firelight, dragging bodies through smoke, dragging him. They had never spoken after that. Walter disappeared after the mission. No ceremony, no parade, just vanished like a ghost. And now here he was, older, quieter, and limping through a town full of strangers who couldn't see past a cane. Meanwhile, at Millersford High School, history teacher Marcus Albright was inspired to assign an impromptu oral history project. His students had been chattering about some old guy who got saluted by a colonel all week, and while most were more fascinated by the gossip than the gravity, he saw an opportunity. He tasked each student to interview someone over 60 about their life experiences. One student, Lexi Romero, rolled her eyes at the assignment until her mother casually mentioned that the guy everyone's been whispering about lived 2 blocks from her best friend's grandparents. Lexi was no history buff. She was more interested in social media than social studies, and she figured talking to the cane guy might earn her bonus points, or at the very least to make a good TikTok story. She wasn't expecting anything deep, just some vague war stories and maybe a weird smell in the living room. When she knocked on Walter Harlan's door the following Saturday, she had her phone recording in her pocket just in case he said something outrageous. Walter opened the door slowly, squinting behind thick lenses. Lexi introduced herself with all the confidence of a teenager who had never been told no. But the moment she mentioned school and a quick interview, Walter tilted his head and gestured her inside with a soft grunt. She followed, awkward at first, clutching her notebook like a shield. She had no idea what to say. He didn't speak much. Instead, he offered her a seat and a cup of weak tea, which she accepted to be polite. It wasn't until her eyes landed on a framed black and white photo hanging crookedly over the mantel that things began to shift. The photo was a group of 6 men in combat gear, squinting under a glaring sun, a hand-painted sign in the background that read, Echo Company, last in, last out. All of them were smiling, though it was the kind of smile that didn't quite reach the eyes. In the center stood Walter, younger, leaner, with a knife strapped to his chest and a bandage around his arm. One of the men beside him looked like a younger version of Colonel McKinney. Lexi asked about the photo, half out of obligation, half out of growing interest. Walter stared at it for a long time before answering. He told her names, not ranks, but names. Charlie, Petey, Morales, NGY, and Carter. He told her about the jungles, about what it was like to feel the sweat burn your eyes before the bullets ever touched you. He told her about the smells of rotten fear and how every morning felt like gambling with fate. He didn't cry. He didn't embellish. He simply recounted the stories like someone recounting the weather. Matter of fact, emotion buried deep down. Lexi stopped recording. Somewhere between his second and third story, she realized she wasn't doing a school project anymore. She was being handed something fragile, something that felt like a confession, not meant for the world, but offered nonetheless. Walter spoke of Charlie, his best friend, the squad medic, the man whose name was carved on the memorial. He spoke of the day Charlie died, how they had been ambushed, and how Charlie had shielded a wounded Vietnamese child with his own body. Lexi didn't say a word. She just wrote down one word in her notebook.
And then Walter finally said something that made her look up. You can fight a war and come home, but the war doesn't stay behind. It follows. Not loud, not angry, just always there, like a shadow. Lexi left the apartment without her usual bounce. She didn't post anything. Instead, she walked straight home and rewrote her assignment. The title at the top of the page was no longer Interview with a Veteran. It was The Man Everyone Forgot. But not everyone would forget for long. The colonel hadn't. The town wouldn't. And soon, the truth about Walter Harlan and the mission buried in the silence of Laos would come to light in a way no one in Millersford was prepared for. The day after Lexi Romero handed in her report, Mr. Albright read it in stunned silence behind his desk, his usual red pen held motionless above the page. He had expected charming anecdotes about fishing trips, first jobs, or old cars, something to pad the grades before the semester ended.
But Lexi's piece was different. It wasn't just well written, it was alive, almost pulsing with weight. It felt like something ancient had been stirred awake. The man everyone forgot didn't read like a school assignment. It read like the beginning of a reckoning. Mr. Albright, a quiet man with a background in journalism before he'd gone into teaching, made a copy of the report and, against the usual protocol, passed it along to an old friend who worked at the Millersford Gazette. He didn't tell Lexi at first, uncertain of how it might play out, but the editor, an Iraq vet himself, read it and called back the same afternoon. "This guy," he said, "is the real deal, and no one knows?" Mr. Albright didn't answer, because that silence was the answer. That weekend, the paper ran a piece titled "The Quiet Hero of 8th Street," with excerpts from Lexi's interview and a brief editorial note about ongoing research into Walter Harlan's service. There was no photo, per Walter's request, but the effect was immediate. People began stopping in front of Walter's building, unsure why they suddenly felt like they were standing near something sacred. Children asked their parents who Echo Company was. Teenagers who once rolled their eyes at veteran stories now Googled places like Laos and Operation Tailwind. Even the young lieutenant who had mocked Walter outside the diner, Lieutenant Prater, walked up to the park memorial that Sunday and stared at it for an hour, not moving once. Across town, Colonel McKinney was working quietly. He had already requested Walter Harlan's complete military file through the Pentagon's archives, using his clearance to bypass the usual red tape. He wasn't looking for medals or commendations. He was looking for confirmation, proof of what he had witnessed, of what had haunted him for over 40 decades. As the digital documents loaded slowly onto his screen, one name stopped him cold: Operation Ember Lance. The mission had been top secret. Not even the families of those involved had been told the full story. Inserted deep behind enemy lines in Laos, Echo Company had been tasked with intercepting a weapons convoy supplying Viet Cong fighters. It was supposed to be a 6-day recon. No firefights, no direct engagement. But it had turned into a 14-day survival ordeal after intel failed and the team was ambushed. Half the unit was wiped out. Communications were lost, no extraction ever arrived, yet somehow a few emerged, McKinney among them, Walter too, and Charlie never made it home. McKinney remembered lying in the mud, bleeding from his leg, delirious with fever and dehydration. He remembered Walter dragging him across a riverbed under fire. He remembered hearing Walter say, "We don't leave anyone, sir. Not today." That voice had stayed in his head like a compass ever since. And now, that same man lived quietly 3 miles from base, dismissed by the very people who owed them their freedom to laugh, to walk without limps, to forget the price of peace. The colonel made a decision, one that would violate every expectation of protocol and bureaucracy, but one he would not regret. He placed a call to the Department of the Navy's Public Affairs Office and requested a full records review for Sergeant First Class Walter J. Harlan, citing honor deficiency due to classified oversight. Then he called the Millersford VFW Hall and requested an emergency meeting. He intended to bring a matter before the town that had never been addressed, not once, in its 100-year history. A retroactive field commendation and civilian recognition ceremony for valor. But while McKinney moved behind the scenes, Walter sat in the dim warmth of his apartment, unaware of the storm beginning to form around him. Or perhaps not unaware, just quietly bracing for it. He hadn't gone back to the park since the salute. The birds were probably waiting, he thought, confused by his absence. He missed their company, not because they filled a silence, but because they never asked questions. Birds didn't care about rank. They never judged limps or scars. They simply landed, watched, and trusted him. He stared at the photograph on the wall again. Echo Company, before everything fell apart, before Laos, before the noise and the fire and the blood-soaked promise he had made to Charlie as the medic died in his arms. "I'll get him out. I'll get McKinney home." That was a promise he had kept, but no one had kept anything for him. The knock on the door surprised him. He wasn't expecting anyone, especially not a man in a dress uniform, flanked by two other officers and a young woman clutching a leather-bound portfolio. McKinney stood tall but unassuming, cap under his arm, his boots just as polished as the day he earned his bars. Walter didn't move right away, just looked up, measured the group like a man who had once measured kill zones. He opened the door slowly.
McKinney didn't wait. He extended a hand and said softly, "It's long overdue, Sergeant." Walter glanced at the hand, then shook it once. His grip still strong, even if his knuckles cracked with the motion. Inside, the officers explained the intent, a formal ceremony, a review of his record, a long-lost commendation to be read publicly. Walter listened, silent, until they were done. Then he said the words that stilled the room. "I didn't do it for medals. I did it because no one else was going to carry him out. Charlie deserved better than jungle dirt. I didn't care if it got me shot, I was not leaving him behind." Lexi, standing quietly near the door, felt tears sting her eyes. She hadn't known Charlie. None of them had. But now, she would never forget him. Or Walter. Or what duty really looked like. Walter didn't say yes, he didn't say no, he just nodded once. Outside, the sun was setting again. But this time, it wasn't just the close of another day in Millersford, it was the beginning of something rising. The days following Colonel McKinney's visit passed slowly, like wind dragging over an open field, steady, quiet, full of anticipation no one could name out loud. Millersford, once content to shuffle through its daily routines without pause, now seemed to lean forward as if listening. Something was shifting. At the park, people spoke in softer tones. At the diner, eyes drifted to the corner booth where Walter Harlan used to sit every Thursday, as though half expecting him to reappear with his worn cane and paper bag of crumbs. But Walter hadn't returned, not yet. He was preparing in a way no one could see. In the modest second-floor apartment on 8th Street, Walter sat at his kitchen table, the light overhead flickering with age, a pot of coffee long since gone cold. The file McKinney had brought sat open before him, filled with papers and faded carbon copies from a war no one liked to talk about. For the first time in years, he had allowed himself to look directly at what he'd spent decades trying to forget. There were letters of commendation that never reached him, citations for bravery held back by classification, and one yellowed page that simply read, "Mission parameters exceeded. Individual actions deemed extraordinary under duress." No signature. Just a stamp. Declassified. Walter had known that recognition might eventually come, not because he wanted it, but because something like truth always found a crack to escape through. He'd carried that truth like a second spine, invisible but heavy, through every job interview that dismissed him for being too stiff, through every glance that asked silently, "What happened to your leg?" through every veterans event where he stood in the back while younger men received plaques. He had done what he did because it was right, not because it would ever be seen. But now it was being seen, and that was harder than he had expected. He reached for his cane, not because he needed to stand, but because the feel of the worn wood in his hand grounded him. The cane was more than a walking aid. It was a companion from another life, carved from a piece of an old tree deep in the Laotian jungle, a gift from an old tribal contact who had once hidden Echo Company from enemy patrols. He had whittled it during a 6-day stretch waiting for exfil, every nick and groove telling a story no one else could read. He had refused to trade it out for a modern aluminum model the VA once offered. He didn't need comfort. He needed memory. He rose slowly and moved to the narrow hallway where he kept a locked footlocker beneath a faded military coat. The key, worn smooth from decades of sweat and habit, turned with a click that seemed to echo louder than it should. Inside the locker were 3 things: a folded American flag, a bundle of letters tied with twine,
and an old canteen that hadn't been used since 1970. Walter removed the letters and carried them back to the table. They were from Charlie. Short, handwritten, uneven script. Letters to a sister in New Jersey, never mailed, collected by Walter after Charlie's death and kept safe ever since. The first began with, "Hey kid, still waiting on that care package full of Oreos." And the last ended with, "If I don't come home, tell Ma I saw the sun come up through the jungle trees, and it was the most beautiful damn thing I ever saw." Walter had always intended to deliver them, but the guilt had kept him away. How do you look into the eyes of someone who lost their world and explain why you got to come home? Why their brother bled out while you held his hand and promised it would be okay, knowing it wasn't? He had tried once. Drove all the way to a small neighborhood in Trenton, parked across the street, watched a young woman, Charlie's niece probably, playing in the yard. He turned the car around and never went back. Now it seemed that silence could no longer be the final word. He needed to go, not to unburden himself, but to honor a promise. Meanwhile, McKinney's preparations for the ceremony were gaining momentum. Word had reached the regional Marine Corps liaison, and what had started as a local initiative had turned into a formal operation. They were planning a full military recognition event at the Millersford Veterans Hall, a building that had never hosted more than annual chili cook-offs and Memorial Day speeches.
The guest list grew longer each day. Veterans from surrounding counties, military historians, even a documentary crew had expressed interest. But most surprising was a call McKinney received late at night from the Pentagon. A senior official had read the initial report and was requesting an official statement from Walter Harlan to be submitted for consideration in a broader recognition project. McKinney agreed, but with a caveat. No one was going to push the sergeant. Walter would speak only if he wanted to. Back in the apartment, Walter wrote a note. Not a speech, not a formal statement, just a note. 10 lines. Direct, unflinching, the kind of language you only learn when life has been stripped to its bones. He folded it and slipped it into an envelope, placing it with Charlie's letters. Then he made a list of things he needed: a new shirt, polish for his boots, and a fresh haircut. He hadn't dressed in full for a ceremony since his discharge, but this time he wasn't dressing for himself. He was dressing for Charlie, for Echo Company, for the ghosts. Lexi, upon hearing about the ceremony, insisted on being involved. She and Mr. Albright coordinated a display to be set up in the hall. Photos, maps, bits of declassified information they'd been granted access to. She even managed to track down 2 surviving members of Echo Company, both living in different corners of the country, both unaware that Walter was still alive. When she called and explained, both men broke down. One said only, "He made it?" The other whispered, "Tell him he still owes me a cigarette." As the ceremony approached, anticipation tightened around the town like a drawn bow. But for Walter Harlan, the tension was different. He wasn't nervous. He was steady, resolved. The years had taken much from him. His youth, his brothers in arms, the easy comfort of belonging. But they had not taken his code. And that code, silent and unseen, was about to speak louder than any metal ever could. The day of the ceremony arrived under skies the color of worn steel, the morning air crisped with the faint bite of late autumn. In Millersford, the sun rose without fanfare, but there was something unmistakably different in the rhythm of the town. Flags lined the streets, not just the small plastic ones handed out during parades, but full-sized banners hung with purpose from storefronts and windows. Children were excused early from school, businesses closed their doors for a few hours, and traffic slowed to a crawl around the Veterans Hall as people streamed toward it, drawn by a story they didn't yet fully understand, but somehow knew they needed to witness. Inside the Veterans Hall, the atmosphere was thick with anticipation. The walls, once bare except for the usual framed photos of nameless men in sepia tones,
now held displays curated by Lexi Romero and her classmates. There were old newspaper clippings, scanned pages of declassified mission reports, a large map of Southeast Asia dotted with pushpins, and at the center, a blown-up photo of Echo Company standing beside their chopper in Laos. The caption beneath read, "Last in, last out, the forgotten heroes of Operation Ember Lance." People gathered quietly, unsure how to act. It wasn't a celebration, but neither was it a funeral. It felt more like a reckoning, a kind of spiritual roll call for a man who had stood in silence for too long. Men in dress uniforms stood beside mechanics in oil-stained coveralls, teenagers beside retirees, police officers beside librarians. The whole town seemed to arrive, and with them a busload of servicemen and women from neighboring counties, many of whom had never heard of Walter Harlan until 2 weeks ago. But when they did, something stirred in them. Recognition of a man whose story mirrored their own fears, their own quiet griefs. Colonel McKinney stood near the front, his chest stiff with ribbons, his expression unreadable, but his eyes rarely leaving the entrance. On a small table beside the podium sat a box, wooden and heavy, bearing the seal of the United States Army. Inside it was a medal that had taken nearly 50 years to find its rightful place, the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest military decoration awarded for extraordinary heroism in combat. It had been recommended in 1971, then buried under the weight of politics and secrecy. Now it waited, not just to be given, but to be received by the man it was made for. At precisely 10 a.m., the room turned toward the doors as they opened with a soft creak. Walter Harlan entered slowly, his cane striking the floor with its familiar rhythm, every step steady and deliberate. He wore a pressed dress shirt beneath a vintage green field jacket, freshly cleaned and adorned with nothing but one combat patch on the shoulder. His boots, old but polished, hit the floor with quiet pride. His hair had been trimmed, his beard combed, and his eyes, clear and direct, swept over the room like a soldier taking account of the field. People stood without being told. It wasn't rehearsed, nor prompted by protocol. It was instinct. The kind of instinct that comes when a man of quiet greatness walks into a room full of people who once saw only his cane and now saw his spine. He nodded once, acknowledging the sea of faces. He walked slowly toward the front, not because he was frail, but because he understood the weight of what this moment carried. For them, not just for him. He paused in front of the colonel, the two men locked eyes, and in a gesture that said more than any words ever could, McKinney stepped back, removed his cap, and snapped to attention with a salute so precise it seemed to cut the air.
Walter did not return the salute immediately. Instead, he reached into his jacket and pulled from the inner pocket a folded piece of paper. He handed it to McKinney. The colonel unfolded it slowly. It was the same note Walter had written at his kitchen table. He cleared his throat, then read it aloud. "I didn't carry them out for medals. I carried them out because we were all we had left. I carried them because Charlie would have carried me. I carried them because we don't leave our own behind, not in jungles, not in memory. If this day means anything, let it mean this. Never measure a man by the limp in his walk or the years on his face. Measure him by the weight he's willing to carry for others." A hush fell over the crowd. Some wept silently. Others clenched their jaws to hold back tears. And a few, especially those in uniform, stood even straighter. McKinney turned back to Walter and reached for the box. He opened it slowly, revealing the medal nestled in its velvet case. He lifted it with reverence, walked the single step forward, and said, with full voice, "For extraordinary heroism and devotion to duty, for actions above and beyond the call, the United States Army awards Sergeant First Class Walter J. Harlan the Distinguished Service Cross." He pinned it on Walter's jacket. For a moment, it glinted in the light. Not bright, not showy, just steady. And then, in one of the most surreal moments Millersford had ever seen, The colonel stepped aside, and a woman came forward from the crowd. She was in her late 60s, wearing a simple navy blouse and holding a small envelope in her hand. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "My name is Eleanor Keating. Charlie was my brother." Walter's eyes widened, not in shock, but in recognition. He hadn't seen her since she was a teenager, waiting outside a base gate with cookies and letters. She stepped forward, handed him the envelope. "I never got to thank you. I always wondered if he was alone. But now I know he wasn't." Walter opened the envelope with shaking hands. Inside were 2 photographs, one of Charlie at age 9, grinning with a fishing rod, and another of a small gravestone with the inscription, "Charles M. Keating. He saved a life, then he gave his." Walter closed his eyes for a long moment. When he opened them, the entire room seemed to exhale. He nodded at Eleanor, then at McKinney, then at the crowd. No speech, no victory pose, just a man standing, not in front of his past, but finally alongside it. Outside, the skies had cleared, the clouds moving on slow and certain, and for the first time in a very long time, so did Walter. After the ceremony ended, the hall slowly emptied as townsfolk whispered amongst themselves in reverent tones, reluctant to leave the gravity of what they had just witnessed. The solemnity of the moment clung to their clothes like smoke from a long-burned fire, a sense that something sacred had taken place and that they had all, in some way, been changed by it. But even as families returned to their homes, children asked questions they never had before, and veterans lingered to swap stories. Walter remained in the same spot where he had received his medal. He stood silently beside the photo display of Echo Company, eyes drifting not to the accolades or the newspaper clippings, but to the small, unassuming portrait of a man in a helmet with a lopsided grin. Charlie Keating, the man he'd carried through the jungle all those years ago. Colonel McKinney approached, walking slowly, his voice low so as not to disrupt the quiet reflection. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he simply stood beside Walter, looking at the same photo, sharing the same silence. When he finally did speak, his words were few but meaningful. He told Walter that this wasn't the end of anything, but perhaps the beginning of something that had been long overdue. Recognition was a strange thing. It didn't change what had happened, didn't rewrite history, but it did offer something like balance, maybe even peace. He placed a hand on Walter's shoulder, not as a superior officer, not as a colonel, but as a brother in arms who understood the language of pain and silence. After McKinney left, Walter remained a while longer. People would glance in his direction, some with admiration, some with guilt for having overlooked him for so long, but none dared disturb his reverie. Eventually, Lexi appeared, clutching a thick binder filled with the research she had compiled, service records, mission logs, photos she had scanned and reprinted. She handed it to Walter, who accepted it without a word. His weathered hands lingered on the cover for a moment before he looked up at her and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Lexi didn't ask for a thank you. She didn't need one. She had learned more from this project than any school assignment had ever taught her. That night, Walter sat alone in his living room, the binder resting on the cable beside him, and the Distinguished Service Cross tucked in its box on the mantel where the old photos of his unit had always been. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt exposed. As if for the first time in decades, the walls he had built around his memories had been cracked open. He had grown used to solitude, to invisibility, but now people saw him again. They knew his name. They knew his story. And they had saluted it. That felt heavier than any rucksack he'd ever carried.
Sleep didn't come easily. When it did, it brought dreams he hadn't had in years. The roar of choppers, the crack of gunfire, the desperate shouts of men trying to make sense of chaos. And through it all, Charlie's voice, steady and calm, calling out coordinates over the radio while enemy fire poured through the trees. Walter woke up just before dawn, his shirt damp with sweat, the cane beside his bed knocked over in the night. He sat on the edge of the mattress, head in his hands, and breathed through the memories until they faded into the morning. The next day, he did something he hadn't done in over 20 years. He walked to the high school. Slowly, of course, leaning on his cane, but with purpose. He passed people on the street who nodded at him differently now, not as the old man they once overlooked, but as someone they were proud to share a town with. When he arrived at the school, he was greeted by Lexi's teacher, who had arranged for Walter to speak to her history class. The students, all of them used to digital distractions and short attention spans, fell silent the moment he entered the room. Walter didn't launch into grand stories or heroic speeches. He started with a question. What do you think a hero looks like? There was an awkward pause and then the usual guesses. Soldiers, firefighters, athletes, celebrities. Walter nodded, then told them about Charlie Keating, about the man who never hesitated to run into fire for his brothers, who cracked jokes even when the odds were stacked against them, who died so that others might live. He spoke about leadership, not as barking orders, but as the quiet decision to be the last one off the field. And he told them that every man in Echo Company had been a hero, not because of medals or headlines, but because they showed up when it mattered and stood their ground when others would have run. When the bell rang at the end of the class, no one moved. The students stayed in their seats, not because they were told to, but because they felt like they were still in the presence of something important. Lexi sat in the front row, her eyes wide, her notebook filled with more than just dates and names. She was writing values, truths, lessons you couldn't find in textbooks. Later that week, Walter received a letter in the mail. It was from a boy in the class who had never spoken during the visit. The letter was short, just a few lines, but it said everything that needed to be said. Thank you for showing us what real strength looks like. I didn't know my grandfather had been in Vietnam until I told you about you. We talked for the first time in a year. Walter folded the letter and placed it inside the binder. He knew then that something had shifted, not just in the town, not just in his own heart, but in the small ripples moving outward from that veterans hall. The story was no longer his alone. It had become a shared legacy. The silence he had carried for so long had been broken, not by force, not by shame, but by honor. And with that, the cane he once leaned on like a burden began to feel, in its own quiet way, like a staff of command, not for leading men into war, but for guiding them out of forgetfulness. The mission wasn't over, it had simply changed. In the days that followed, Walter became a quiet but steady presence around town, not in a way that demanded attention, but in a way that gently commanded respect. Where once people might have looked past the old man with the cane, now they paused when they saw him. The mechanic down at Barker's garage offered to change the oil in Walter's truck for free. The barista at the coffee shop set aside his usual black brew without even asking. Children waved at him as he passed, not fully understanding why they should, only knowing that their parents had told them he was someone worth acknowledging. And as much as Walter didn't need the fanfare, he couldn't deny the subtle warmth it stirred in a heart long accustomed to solitude. But while the town buzzed with the afterglow of the ceremony, Walter noticed a different pattern re-emerging, one he hadn't seen in years but recognized all too well. It was in the small things, the way people spoke of heroism as something that lived only in the past or only in uniforms. It was in how some younger veterans sat silently during community events, offering tight smiles but rarely speaking, often fading into the background. Walter saw it in the way they excused themselves early, the way their eyes tracked exits, the way their shoulders tensed at unexpected sounds. And he remembered vividly what it felt like to come home to a world that didn't understand the war you had brought back with you. At the local VFW hall one evening, Walter sat in on a gathering meant for returning veterans.
The room was sparsely populated, mostly younger men and women who looked like they hadn't yet decided whether they wanted to be there. They sat at scattered tables, nursing drinks or thumbing through their phones, faces dimly lit by the blue glow of screens. No one made much effort to speak. A few offered nods when Walter entered, but most kept to themselves. He didn't interrupt their silence. He simply took a seat in the corner and waited.
After a while, a young man with close-cropped hair and a prosthetic arm sat down near him. He didn't say anything at first, just looked at Walter's cane and then looked away. Eventually, he broke the silence with a dry chuckle and said, "That thing yours or government issued?" Walter smirked faintly and replied that it was his own doing. He'd earned the limp fair and square in a place no map really ever bothered to remember. The young man laughed once and said his own souvenir came from a roadside bomb in Kandahar. The two sat there, not needing to explain the details because the important things didn't require explanation. Walter listened more than he spoke, asking just enough to draw stories out of the man. Stories of patrols, of loss, of the strange emptiness that came not from combat, but from the quiet after it. The young man, whose name was Andrew, talked about how hard it was to go back to school when no one understood why he couldn't sit near windows or why he flinched at certain sounds. He talked about feeling out of place, even in his own home, like he'd returned to a life that no longer fit. Walter nodded through it all, his face calm, his eyes knowing. When Andrew trailed off, Walter told him softly that the hardest part wasn't surviving the war, it was surviving the peace. That line hung in the air like a truth that couldn't be unsaid. A few others had drifted closer, listening without making it obvious. Walter stood slowly, cane in hand, and addressed the room, not with a speech, not with grandstanding, but with a story about a time when he came back from a jungle half the world away, stepped off the bus, and no one met him. About how he went back to work at the hardware store and never spoke a word of Vietnam for 30 years. About the nightmares, the guilt, and the quiet shame of surviving when better men didn't. He told them about Charlie Keating, about the day Echo Company was ambushed, and about how silence had been both his shield and his prison. He admitted that he'd hidden behind his cane for years, not because he couldn't walk without it, but because it gave people a reason not to ask questions. And then he told them that the only thing worse than being forgotten was believing you deserved to be. When he finished, the room was quiet, not with discomfort, but with a shared understanding that something sacred had just been spoken aloud. From that night on, more veterans began showing up, not just to the VFW meetings, but to each other's homes, to coffee meetups, to barbecues and school events. Walter became a kind of anchor, not because he offered answers, but because he reminded them they weren't alone. Lexi helped organize a local project to record their oral histories, bringing her classmates in to document interviews and scan photos. She called it the Living Archive, and it became more than a school project. It became a community effort. Still, Walter knew the true weight of healing wasn't just in remembering, it was in finding purpose. So he proposed something bold, a mentorship program pairing older veterans with younger ones, not to teach, but to listen, to be present, to bear witness, and in doing so, to let each generation pass on something deeper than medals or tactics: resilience, humility, and the courage to keep living fully even after the uniforms were folded away. As the town embraced this new chapter, the same people who had once mocked Walter's cane now saw it differently. It was no longer a symbol of weakness, but of endurance, a testament to a journey that didn't end with a discharge date. And while the cane still tapped the pavement with each step, its rhythm had changed. It no longer sounded like struggle, it sounded like legacy. As autumn settled into Granger, painting the town in strokes of amber, crimson, and fading green,
The rhythms of daily life took on a quieter tone. School buses hissed at their stops. Farmers prepared their final harvest. Shop owners wrapped their windows in harvest-themed decor. And in the middle of it all, Walter's cane continued its steady beat along the sidewalks, like a metronome, marking time not just in footsteps, but in something deeper, presence. He was no longer the old man people politely ignored. He was now a thread in the town's social fabric, a quiet force that stitched together something lost and fragile. But Walter felt a heaviness growing inside, a kind of echo from the past that refused to be silenced by ceremonies or interviews or well-meaning nods. The recognition he'd received, while meaningful, had also opened a floodgate of memories he'd worked hard to keep sealed. Every word he shared with younger veterans stirred something he hadn't touched in decades. Their struggles mirrored his, and while he offered them guidance and presence, it came at a cost. Each night the dreams came stronger. Not chaotic firefights or bloody skirmishes. Those had long ago faded into shadow. No, these dreams were quieter and crueler. A child's face glimpsed through jungle leaves. The sound of rain hitting metal. The look in Charlie Keating's eyes when he made that final call to hold the ridge while Walter and 2 others escaped. The dreams were full of moments where choices had consequences, where survival tasted more like betrayal than victory. Walter tried not to show it, but Lexi noticed. She had grown more perceptive since their bond began, and now she watched him with the quiet attentiveness of someone who genuinely cared. She noticed when he paused too long before speaking. She saw the way he stared at nothing during long silences. One afternoon, after school, she stopped by his house with a folder full of interview transcripts for the Living Archive project.
She handed them over, but instead of leaving, she lingered by the porch steps. Walter, sensing something unspoken, invited her to sit. She hesitated, then asked, in a voice much softer than usual, if talking about the past ever made it easier. Walter looked at her for a long moment. He could have brushed it off, could have given her a line about time healing wounds, but he didn't. Instead, he told her the truth, that talking sometimes made it worse, not better. That some pain didn't fade, it just changed shape. And that while sharing his story gave others courage, it often left him drained, like he was bleeding history drop by drop. Lexi nodded, her eyes glistening, not with pity but with understanding. She admitted that she'd read some things in the archive that shook her, letters from soldiers who never made it home, journal entries full of fear and faith and longing. She said it made her feel small and powerless, like she didn't know what to do with what she now knew. Walter told her that feeling was the beginning of something powerful, that being changed by someone else's truth was the first step toward compassion, and that compassion, if acted upon, could change lives. He reminded her that not every battle had a uniform, and that maybe her role wasn't to fight but to witness, to hold space for others, to preserve their truth so it wouldn't be forgotten. Lexi didn't reply right away, but when she left, she hugged him. It wasn't the awkward hug of a teenager unsure of boundaries. It was the deep, wordless embrace of someone who had just taken on a piece of someone else's burden and promised, silently, to carry it with care. That night, Walter sat in his living room surrounded by silence, not lonely, but aware of its weight. The photographs on his wall, the medals, the faded Polaroids from Vietnam, the newspaper clipping of the ceremony seemed to glow in the dim light. He looked at the picture of Charlie Keating. It was a candid shot taken the night before their final mission. Charlie had been laughing, holding up a coffee mug as if toasting an unseen future. Walter reached out and touched the glass frame, his fingers trembling. A young father and his son walked past, pausing behind him. The boy tugged at his dad's shirt and whispered, "Was he a hero?" Walter didn't turn around. He just said softly, "They all were." Outside, the sky darkened with the hint of rain, and Walter pulled his coat tighter. The cane thudded against the concrete in steady rhythm, but his pace was slower today, more deliberate. He passed a group of teenagers sitting on the courthouse steps, laughing and scrolling on their phones.
One of them, a boy with a varsity jacket, looked up and recognized him. He nudged his friends, they quieted. Then, without a word, the boy stood and nodded respectfully as Walter walked past. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't performative, it was just a nod, from one generation to another. And in that quiet gesture, Walter saw the beginnings of something he'd long thought impossible: understanding without spectacle, reverence without requirement. The respect he had long thought buried in history had not vanished, it had simply waited for the right people to listen. As the days shortened and winter approached with its bitter bite, the town of Granger slipped into its end-of-year rhythms. Streetlights cast longer shadows, and breath turned to fog in the early mornings. At the town square, the community began preparations for the annual Veterans Appreciation Ceremony, a local tradition where townsfolk gathered to honor those who served, read names aloud, and raised flags stitched with the names of fallen heroes. It was a time of collective memory and shared pride. But this year, there was a different kind of energy surrounding the event. Quiet whispers drifted through cafes and barbershops, stories circulating about the old man with the cane. Walter Harlan had become a living symbol not because he sought attention, but because his story had reminded people of the invisible giants who walked among them unnoticed. The committee organizing the event had invited Walter to speak. He had initially refused. Public speaking had never appealed to him, and the thought of standing before a crowd, spilling wounds dressed up as words, unsettled him. But Lexi, ever persistent, had nudged him gently. She didn't guilt him or plead, she simply told him that silence, while sacred, could sometimes rob others of the wisdom they needed most. And so, after some quiet reflection, Walter agreed, but he made one condition clear: no grand introduction, no inflated titles, and no mention of medals. If he was to speak, it would be as a man, not a myth.
In the days leading up to the ceremony, Walter found himself sorting through old trunks in the attic, boxes packed with time and dust, letters yellowed at the corners, photographs brittle with age, commendations he never hung, and a uniform folded neatly in a sealed plastic wrap. He hadn't worn it in decades. Its deep green fabric still held the faintest scent of cedar and metal polish. As he unwrapped it, a rush of emotion overwhelmed him. His hands ran across the sleeve where the faded patch of Echo Company was stitched, a small symbol that once marked him as part of something greater than himself. He sat on the edge of the bed, uniform draped across his lap, and thought of the men who had worn theirs into battle and never returned. The fabric felt heavier than it should have, like it carried not just stitches and thread, but stories and ghosts. He decided then that he wouldn't just bring the uniform, he would wear it. Not as a show, not for applause, but as a quiet testament to the past, to those who could no longer speak for themselves. The morning of the ceremony dawned gray and cold. Snow had not yet arrived, but the sky hung heavy with its promise. People filed into the town square, bundled in coats and scarves, holding coffee cups and programs. Flags lined the perimeter, flapping gently in the breeze. Veterans of every generation took their seats near the front, some in wheelchairs, some standing proudly, others holding canes or leaning on the arms of loved ones. The crowd was larger than expected. Word had spread beyond Granger. Nearby towns had sent representatives, and a few regional reporters had even arrived, hoping to capture the story behind the old man with the cane. When Walter arrived, there was a hush that rippled across the crowd. He walked slowly, but without hesitation, his cane tapping against the stone path, his uniform pressed and immaculate. Time had aged him, but in that moment, he stood straighter, as though the weight of his memories had finally settled into something stable. His silver hair peeked from beneath a marine cover, and the bars on his shoulders, once dismissed or ignored, now drew reverent attention. Lexi stood near the front, holding a clipboard, eyes wide with quiet pride.
She had seen him in so many ways, gruff, wise, tired, patient, but never quite like this. As Walter stepped onto the wooden platform, he didn't look out over the crowd. He looked at the flag, and only when it stopped flapping in the wind did he begin to speak. He didn't start with war stories. He didn't list his rank or recount acts of valor. He talked about silence, about how the hardest part of coming home wasn't what people thought. It wasn't the memories or the nightmares. It was the invisibility, the way people looked through you, assumed your cane meant weakness, or that your quietness meant you had nothing to say. He spoke about the men he'd known, the ones who laughed before battle and cried after, the ones who gave everything and never made it back. He spoke about Lexi and how one young person's willingness to listen had reopened a door he thought permanently closed. And then, with a slight tremble in his voice, he said something that silenced even the rustle of jackets and programs. There's no expiration date on service. It doesn't end when the bullets stop flying or when the uniform comes off. Sometimes it gets harder after the last shot is fired, and we carry that weight in silence, hoping one day someone will notice. I was lucky. Someone did. There was no applause at first, just stillness, a collective holding of breath. And then, slowly, people began to rise, not to clap, but to stand in quiet acknowledgement. Among them was a tall figure in a modern Marine dress uniform, sharp as a blade, chest lined with campaign ribbons. Colonel Matthew Dane had driven in from the regional base when he heard about the ceremony. As Walter descended the steps from the platform, the colonel stepped forward, cut through the crowd, and stood at attention. He raised his hand in a sharp, precise salute. It was the kind of salute reserved for heroes, the kind that bridged generations, the kind that said without words, I see you, I know who you are, and I honor you. Walter stopped. For a moment, his eyes locked with the colonel's, and then, slowly, he returned the salute, not as a frail old man, not as a myth, but as a Marine. The crowd didn't erupt. They didn't need to. The silence was enough. In it lived decades of sacrifice, dignity, and truth. And in that moment, no one saw a cane. They saw a soldier. After the ceremony, the energy in the square shifted. People no longer looked at Walter Hillman with the detached curiosity they once held. The man with the cane, once passed over without a second glance, now walked among the townspeople as a living symbol of something deeper than medals or stories. He represented the parts of history that no one had ever bothered to ask about. Strangers approached him gently, some with handshakes, others with soft thanks and eyes that shimmered with something like guilt. A few elderly veterans in the crowd who had once kept their own silence nodded at Walter, the kind of nod that only men who've seen the same horrors can offer each other. But it was the young people, students, children, even teenagers with earbuds half in, who circled closest. Lexi stood beside him, fielding questions and guiding the more respectful ones toward meaningful conversations. To Walter's surprise, they didn't want war stories filled with explosions and medals. They asked about the quiet parts. They asked what it felt like to come home to a world that had already moved on.
They asked how long it took before he could sleep through the night, or whether it was harder to fight or to forget. And for the first time in decades, Walter found himself talking about the things no one had ever asked. He spoke of the long boat rides home, the way every creak of the ship made him flinch, how the silence of the sea mocked the screaming he still heard in his head. He told them about a friend named Ortiz who had died saving 3 others, and how he still saw Ortiz's mother in his dreams, even though they'd never met. He described the first time he walked back into a grocery store and couldn't understand why people were complaining about cereal brands,
How surreal it felt to care about anything so trivial after surviving the unimaginable. The more he talked, the lighter he seemed to become, as if each word chipped away at the shell that time and silence had built around his memories. But the crowds eventually thinned. The square emptied. The flags were folded, the stage taken down. Only a few close faces remained. Lexi, of course, and her father, Tom, who hadn't said much all day but had stood nearby like a quiet guardian. The Marine colonel who had saluted Walter earlier came back with a folded flag in his hand and extended an invitation. There was a private military reunion at the base happening the following weekend, an event that honored not only recent veterans, but those from earlier generations, many of whom had gone unnoticed or undocumented. Walter hesitated. The idea of seeing others like him, of opening old wounds and meeting ghosts dressed in living flesh, made his chest tighten. But Lexi squeezed his arm gently and said that maybe the past needed a witness, that maybe it was time to stop carrying it alone. Back home that evening, the house felt different, not because it had changed, but because Walter had. He walked a little straighter, his cane now a choice rather than a crutch. The uniform hung neatly in his room, but he didn't pack it away just yet. Instead, he placed it on the back of a chair where the morning sun would catch it. He sat at the kitchen table, and for the first time in years, he pulled out the small leather journal he'd kept from his deployment. The pages were stained, torn in places, and brittle, but the ink held. He flipped through them slowly, stopping on entries that read more like confessions than logs. Some were written during firefights, others under makeshift tents in the rain, and a few in hospital wards where the smell of antiseptic mixed with blood. As he read, Walter didn't cry. He didn't flinch. He absorbed the words like nutrients, recognizing the voice as his younger self, but with the weight of age giving them a deeper meaning. The next morning, Walter took a walk through town, not to be seen, not for ceremony, just to walk. He passed the bakery where he'd been ignored for years, and this time, the woman behind the counter waved before he reached the door. He passed the mechanic shop where the boys had laughed behind his back once, and one of them stepped forward to offer him a free oil change. He declined, but with a smile. The world hadn't changed overnight, but something in its rhythm had adjusted. It had remembered him, or perhaps it had finally seen him. At the library, he donated his journal to a local military history archive being assembled by the town. Lexi had started it, collecting first-hand stories from older veterans who'd been too shy or humble to speak before. Walter's journal would be the first, a spark for others to follow. As he handed it over, he felt a strange pang. It wasn't loss, it was legacy, and it felt like letting go in the best way. That night, Lexi came by with a new project, a podcast. She wanted to record Walter's stories, not just for YouTube or social media, but for schools, for community centers, for anyone willing to listen. He grumbled at first, said he didn't know the first thing about microphones or digital files, but she told him she'd handle the tech. All he had to do was talk. And so Walter sat in front of a small microphone, surrounded by old photos, campaign maps, and a glass of water. He cleared his throat and began, not with a dramatic opener, but with a simple line that carried decades of silence behind it. No one ever asked me what it felt like to come home, so I'm going to tell you. And with that, Walter Hillman, the man once mocked for his cane, began to rewrite the story no one knew he carried. By the end of the week, the first episode of the podcast was already circulating among the town's high school students and veterans groups. Lexi had edited it with care, preserving the roughness in Walter's voice, the slow rhythm of his speech, the occasional pauses where emotion sat too thick to pass. It was raw, unpolished, and utterly human, and that was exactly what made it resonate. By Friday, her inbox was overflowing with messages from people who had listened. Some were children asking if they could send thank you letters. Others were veterans who said they hadn't talked about the war in decades, but were now willing to try. A few were widows and widowers who finally felt like someone had spoken a version of their pain aloud. Walter, for his part, didn't fully grasp the scale of what he'd started. To him, he had just told the truth, finally, without flinching, without polishing it into something heroic. He didn't understand how rare that was, how healing it could be for others to hear the unvarnished reality from someone who had walked through fire and returned not with pride, but perspective.
He recorded a second episode, then a third. Each one focused not on battles, but on moments, the long stillness before a firefight. The night a young corporal asked Walter to write a letter to his mother because he knew he wouldn't survive the next day. The absurdity of eating canned peaches under gunfire. The sound of Christmas carols drifting from a radio buried in a foxhole. He spoke of guilt, survivor's guilt, yes, but also the quieter guilt of trying to live a normal life afterward, of laughing at dinner while knowing others never had the chance. Walter didn't script anything. He simply remembered, and Lexi captured it. Together, they built an archive of soul. But something deeper was happening too. Each word spoken seemed to unravel some part of the tightly wound knot inside Walter's chest. His shoulders relaxed more often. His dreams, while still sometimes vivid, no longer left him drenched in sweat and gasping. He stopped flinching at loud noises. He began sleeping with the windows open. The house, once a bunker, became a home again. Tom started dropping by more frequently, sometimes with coffee, sometimes just to sit in silence. There were no grand apologies between them, no formal reconciliation speech. But one day, Tom brought over a photo album with a picture of his own father in uniform, a man Walter had served alongside, though neither had realized it until then. They laughed about it, the strangeness of time, the smallness of the world. That afternoon, Tom called Walter Sir without a trace of mockery, and Walter called him Son with a tone that carried no judgment. In the midst of all this, the town itself was undergoing a quiet transformation. The high school added a new unit to its curriculum, Oral Histories of American Veterans. Lexi was asked to co-lead a few sessions, and Walter agreed to come in as a guest speaker. He wore a pressed shirt, slacks, and his old campaign hat. The cane, still ever present, was no longer a symbol of limitation, but of endurance. When he walked into the classroom, no one laughed. In fact, the room went silent with respect. Walter stood in front of a digital whiteboard, unfamiliar with the gadgets, but sure of his voice. He told them that war was not glory. It was loss carried in layers, that bravery didn't always look like action movies, that true courage was often found in what came afterward, the rebuilding, the forgiveness, the return to kindness in a world that had trained you for destruction. A student raised his hand and asked Walter if he regretted serving. He paused, the room holding its breath, before replying that he didn't regret the duty, but he regretted the silence that followed. He regretted letting others shape the story of what it meant to serve, of who veterans were, based on uniforms and medals, instead of experience and emotion. He said the real fight didn't end on the battlefield. It began at home, where silence built walls higher than any enemy. Word of the podcast, of the school visits, of the transformation in Walter's life began to spread beyond the town. A regional veterans organization reached out, offering to host a statewide conference where Walter could speak. Lexi wanted to go with him. So did Tom. It felt strange, being invited as a speaker rather than a relic. Walter hesitated, not out of fear, but humility. He never sought a stage, only understanding. But Lexi reminded him that sometimes people need someone like him on a stage, not to be inspired in the usual way, but to be reminded of what humanity looks like after the fire has passed. That evening, as Walter walked along the riverside trail behind his house, he stopped to rest on a bench. The setting sun painted the water gold. A family walked by, 2 kids running ahead, their laughter echoing, and the father nodded respectfully at Walter, recognizing him not by name but by presence. The gesture was small, but it struck deep. Once invisible, now acknowledged. Once dismissed, now listened to. Walter breathed in the warm summer air and realized something profound.
The cane had once been a burden. Now it was a symbol of the journey, not just of pain endured, but of weight shared, stories spoken, silence broken. He stood up, steadied himself, and walked back toward the house, already thinking about what he would say in the next recording. This time, he wanted to talk about joy, the unexpected kind, the joy that comes from being heard, not as a hero, but as a human. The invitation came in a stiff manila envelope addressed to Walter in clean, precise handwriting. It bore the seal of the state's Department of Veterans Affairs, but also a gold-embossed Marine emblem that Lexi recognized immediately. Tucked inside was a formal letter requesting Walter's presence as a keynote speaker at the annual statewide Veterans Leadership Summit. Beneath the letterhead, a personal note was scrawled in tight script. "Your voice matters more than ever. We need stories like yours now. Please honor us by attending. Colonel Marcus L. Hargrave, USMC." Walter blinked at the name, uncertain whether it meant anything to him, but Lexi's eyes went wide. Colonel Hargrave was no ordinary figure. He was a decorated combat leader, now retired, who had turned his post-military years into a mission of reshaping how America supported its veterans. He'd authored 2 books, testified before Congress, and was revered for his commitment to mental health reform within the military community. The idea that he knew Walter's name was surreal. Tom offered to drive, Lexi insisted on coming too, and despite Walter's initial hesitation, they all piled into Tom's battered Ford SUV on a foggy Thursday morning, making the 3-hour drive across the state to a conference center that looked more like a federal courthouse than anything inviting.
As they pulled into the parking lot, Walter adjusted his collar nervously. His cane, polished and steadier now with added reinforcement, tapped lightly against the asphalt as they walked toward the building. He felt small again for a moment, swallowed by the scale of it all, by the sleek suits, the military uniforms adorned with rows of ribbons, the polished badges and sharp creases that filled the lobby. He didn't look like them, he didn't walk like them, and in his mind, he didn't belong with them. The conference itself had already begun. The morning sessions had wrapped up, and now a crowd of nearly 400 attendees, soldiers, policymakers, VA counselors, mental health advocates, and military families, were gathered in the main auditorium for the keynote segment. Walter was ushered backstage by a young Marine staffer who saluted him with genuine deference. Walter, as always, waved it off awkwardly. From behind the curtain, he could see the rows of seats, the camera crews, the enormous banner overhead that read, "Every story counts." He was about to speak into a microphone that would carry his voice farther than it had ever gone. Lexi stood beside him and whispered encouragement. Tom simply gave him a quiet nod. A woman in a dark suit introduced him with grace, summarizing his podcast's unexpected success and calling him one of the most necessary storytellers of this generation. The audience applauded politely at first. Then Walter stepped onto the stage. There was no podium, only a chair and a handheld mic. He didn't sit. He stood, leaning slightly on his cane, and waited for the room to quiet on its own. When it did, he cleared his throat and began, not with a joke, not with a greeting, but with a story. He told them about the sandstorm in Kandahar, about the time he shared a meal with a boy who didn't speak his language but understood kindness, about the night he pulled a wounded Marine out of a flipped vehicle under enemy fire. He told them about the silence afterward, about the way he came home and let the world assume he was broken because it was easier to correct them, about the boys who laughed at his cane and the way it reminded him not of injury, but of resilience. The room was silent, truly silent, not even the shuffle of phones or coughing. When he paused, it was reverent. When he spoke, they leaned in. As he neared the end, Walter scanned the crowd, eyes catching faces frozen in attention. But then, from the front row, someone stood up. A tall, commanding man in a dark green dress uniform. Colonel Marcus Hargrave. He didn't speak, didn't wave, didn't interrupt. He raised his hand in a sharp, perfect salute, the kind that could cut air, the kind that meant everything in the language of military respect. The room seemed to inhale as one. Walter faltered for a half-second, stunned. Then slowly, awkwardly but firmly, he returned the salute.
His cane wobbled slightly as he stood taller, his hand raised with steady dignity. The silence broke into thunder. The crowd erupted, not in polite applause, but in a standing ovation that seemed to rise like a wave crashing over the years of invisibility, over the shame and the forgetting. Walter didn't cry, but his hand shook slightly as he lowered it. He gave a final thank you and stepped off stage, this time not alone. Hargrave was waiting. He extended his hand first, and Walter took it, both men locking eyes with mutual understanding that required no words. Hargrave leaned in and said softly, "You gave us back something we lost, the honesty." Then he turned to the crowd and gestured toward Walter. "This man is the reason I wear this uniform with humility. Never again will I allow silence to steal valor from those who've earned it in ways medals can't show."
Walter didn't remember walking backstage. He didn't remember the cameras or the press or even the handshake line that followed. What he remembered was that salute. It didn't just validate his voice, it elevated it. It told every young man and woman in that room, in that audience, and in that country that the worth of a person could not be measured by posture or rank or ribbons, that sometimes the most powerful man in the room walked with a limp. Later, as they sat in the quiet of a diner on the way home, Lexi reviewed the audio she'd recorded. Tom scrolled through a growing list of messages on the podcast's account, thousands of shares, thousands of comments, people asking for more, not out of entertainment, but from aching need. Walter sat in the booth, his coffee warm, his eyes tired but alert. Something had changed that day, not just for him, for all of them. The cane was still there, but now it walked in front of him, not behind. It wasn't a symbol of burden anymore. It was a banner of survival. The days that followed the summit were unlike anything Walter had ever experienced. His name, once buried in silence and invisibility, was now spoken with reverence across veteran communities, social media circles, and local news stations. Videos of his speech had gone viral, not in the way celebrity clips trended, but in a quieter, more powerful wave that swept through veteran Facebook groups, Twitter threads run by military families, and YouTube channels dedicated to real American heroism. The image that stuck with everyone, what resonated most deeply, was the moment Colonel Hargrave stood and saluted him, a man of rank honoring a man forgotten. A former ghost brought into the light not with pity, but with the purest form of respect. That image had become a symbol in itself, shared with the caption, "True valor never ages."
Walter, still overwhelmed by the attention, tried to keep his daily life unchanged. He continued walking to the park in the mornings, though now the security guards didn't glance at his cane with judgment. They gave him small nods instead. One of them, a younger man named Eric, even stopped him to shake his hand, said his grandfather, a Korean war vet, had cried watching his speech. That moment reminded Walter how many had been watching silently from the margins, needing someone to speak for them. The podcast, meanwhile, had exploded in popularity. Lexi could barely keep up with the emails flooding in. Dozens of veterans from every branch wrote in to share their stories, raw, unpolished, and filled with truths that had long been buried. Walter responded to as many as he could, some with words, some just with ears. Listening, he realized, was often the greatest honor a person could give. Tom, always the steady hand behind the scenes, offered to help set up a formal nonprofit around the podcast. Not a business, Walter insisted, but a movement. One that offered a platform for those who'd felt invisible for too long. Lexi began organizing episodes by theme, stories of combat, of coming home, of what it meant to live with the things you couldn't talk about. She invited guests, not only veterans, but also the families who loved them, the medics who healed them, the chaplains who buried their friends. Walter's living room transformed into a studio, not through fancy equipment, but with purpose. A flag folded in a glass case sat on the shelf behind him, a silent reminder of those who hadn't returned. He didn't talk about it much, but it was clear the flag belonged to someone close,
someone whose memory he carried every time he hit record. Then came the invitation to speak at a local high school. It came from a history teacher who had seen the video and wanted his students to understand service beyond textbooks. Walter agreed, albeit reluctantly. He was nervous walking through those crowded hallways, his cane clacking softly on the tile, surrounded by the chattering noise of youth. But as he stepped into the auditorium filled with students, something unexpected happened. The room fell quiet. The same hush he'd felt at the summit washed over the teenagers, their curiosity tempered by respect. He told them what war did to the body, yes, but more so what silence did to the soul. He told them how the worst part wasn't the injury, but the years of invisibility that followed. And then he told them how that silence could be broken, not by shouting, but by sharing. One student stood up after and asked, "How do you keep going after losing so much?" Walter paused, considering. Then he answered, "Because someone once walked beside me when I thought no one would. And now it's my turn to do the same." That line stuck. Lexi repeated it in a post that gained traction across social media, turning into the new unofficial slogan of their movement. Now it's my turn to do the same. Teachers began writing in requesting printed materials. Schools wanted copies of the podcast transcripts. Community centers asked for recorded messages to play on Veterans Day. Walter never expected to become a voice for anyone, but the more he leaned into it, the more he realized he had been preparing for this his entire life. Still, the most powerful moment came not from a crowd, but from a single letter. It arrived one morning in a plain envelope, no return address. Inside was a short handwritten note in shaky cursive. "Dear Mr. Walter, I'm 92. I've never told anyone about what I saw in the war. I thought no one cared. After hearing you, I told my grandson. He cried. I didn't know how badly I needed to be heard. Thank you." Walter held that note in both hands, his fingers trembling. For all the speeches, all the salutes, all the fanfare, this letter reminded him why he did it. Not for recognition, but for redemption. Not only his, but everyone else's who thought their story ended in silence. As the podcast continued to grow, Walter began inviting former critics onto the show. Not to shame them, but to bridge understanding. One of them was an old neighbor who had once mocked his cane during a July 4th picnic years ago. The man appeared nervous on the episode, but Walter welcomed him warmly. They talked honestly, and by the end, the neighbor apologized. Not just to Walter, but to the thousands listening. That episode received more responses than any other. Forgiveness, it seemed, resonated even more deeply than heroism. The town that had once looked past Walter now looked up to him, not in worship, but with appreciation. He wasn't placed on a pedestal. He was seen, finally, as someone who had always been there, quietly bearing the weight of something bigger than most could understand. Even the boys who once snickered at his cane avoided his gaze now, not out of fear, but out of newfound humility. Some even came up to him, awkward and contrite, asking questions about service, about sacrifice, about what it meant to carry pain with dignity. As Walter walked through the park one evening, the sun sinking low behind the treetops, he paused near the bench where it all began. Lexi sat beside him, camera in her lap, ready to film a new introduction for their latest season. He looked at her, then out at the quiet field ahead. So much had changed. And yet the most important things, dignity, honesty, humility, had simply been waiting for the world to see them again. He didn't need a uniform. He didn't need applause. What he had now was a voice. And after so many years, it had finally found its place in the world.
The sun rose on a morning unlike any other, and Walter Granger, cane in hand and resolve in heart, stood at the edge of the Veterans Memorial Garden that had just been built in the heart of town. It hadn't been part of a political campaign or a flashy donation drive. It had begun with a single conversation, one Walter had with the mayor after the summit, in a quiet corner of the community center.
From that seed had grown a garden filled with plaques, small benches engraved with names that once sat on forgotten gravestones, and a towering bronze sculpture of a kneeling soldier, hand on heart, not in combat, but in reflection. The town council had insisted on naming the garden after Walter, but he refused. It wasn't about him, he told them. It was about them. All of them. The silent ones. The ghosts who never asked for praise. The tired warriors who walked through life with wounds no one could see. Now families came here to sit, to remember, to reconnect. Schools scheduled field trips. Local veterans gathered every Sunday morning for coffee under the sycamore trees. What once had been a neglected patch of overgrown land near the library had become sacred ground, a living reminder of the past carried forward with purpose. Walter, though, never stayed long. He'd walk through, tip his hat to a few visitors, gently touch the metal of the sculpture, then move on. For him, the real memorial was in the people who now walked with different eyes that saw beyond the cane, beyond the wrinkles, beyond the years. Lexi's podcast had grown into a full-fledged production with volunteers from across the state. Retired service members now ran interviews, edited episodes, and even offered peer counseling sessions over Zoom. One of them was a former Air Force medic who had reached out after the third episode, saying Walter's voice reminded him of a man he'd served with in Iraq. Now he managed a team that followed up with every veteran who wrote in. No message was left unread, no voice unheard. What had started in a dusty living room with a microphone and a folding chair had become a lifeline for thousands. But even in all that growth, Walter kept his role simple. He was the steady heartbeat, the voice at the start of each episode, the listener, the bridge. One autumn day, a letter arrived addressed not to Walter, but to the man with the cane. It came from a middle school in Montana, where a class had listened to his story as part of a Veterans Week program. Each student had written a paragraph, and the teacher had bundled them into one large envelope. Walter opened them slowly, reading every word. Some were clumsy, others deeply moving, but what they shared was an honesty unfiltered by adulthood. I didn't know veterans could be sad until I heard your voice. I want to be brave like you, not just in war, but when people don't understand me. Thank you for being strong even when people weren't nice to you. He placed the letters in a wooden box he kept by his reading chair, beside an old photo of himself and the men from his unit laughing under desert sun. In time, the men who had mocked him that day in the auditorium began to change. One of them, Dennis Rourke, the brash local entrepreneur whose remarks had echoed loudest, requested a private meeting. Tom and Lexi were hesitant, but Walter agreed. They met in a quiet diner, no cameras, no witnesses. Dennis, visibly nervous, apologized not with excuses, but with clarity. He confessed to projecting his own insecurities about age and failure onto Walter that day. He said seeing a Marine colonel salute him had shaken something loose, something he hadn't even known was trapped inside. Walter listened, nodded, and forgave him. Not because Dennis deserved it, but because Walter knew the cost of carrying grudges heavier than bullet wounds. They parted with a handshake, and the next week, Dennis made a public donation to fund vocational training for unemployed veterans in the county. One day, during a special Veterans Day ceremony, Walter was invited to give the keynote address at Arlington's main parade. It was an honor he never sought, but humbly accepted. As he stepped onto the stage in front of thousands, his cane steady beneath him, the crowd rose, not out of habit, but out of genuine gratitude. He spoke not about himself, but about others. The mail clerk who never made it home, the cook who shielded his team during a mortar strike, the nurse who kept writing letters for wounded soldiers who could no longer hold pens.
He reminded everyone that behind every flag-draped coffin was a life that mattered, not just in death, but in how they had lived. He ended with a simple message: respect begins where judgment ends. After the speech, a young boy ran up to him, maybe 7 or 8, a miniature version of the next generation, saluting with too much excitement and not enough formality. Walter chuckled, returned the salute, and handed him a small pin he carried in his coat pocket, an eagle with folded wings. "Carry this," he said, "and remember that strength doesn't always look the way you expect." The boy's mother, holding back tears, whispered that her husband had served but rarely spoke about it. Walter handed her a card with the podcast name on it and told her they were always listening. In his final years, Walter never sought more applause. He spent his mornings at the garden, his afternoons on the porch, and his evenings reading letters or recording thoughts for future episodes. When the end came, it did so quietly, in his sleep, with the box of student letters resting on his bedside table.
His funeral was simple, as he had asked, with no eulogies and no fanfare. But as the final notes of taps faded, Colonel Hargrave, now retired and older himself, stepped forward in full dress uniform. He stood at the foot of the casket, straightened his spine despite a visible limp, and offered one last salute. Then he whispered just loud enough for those nearby to hear, "You showed us how to walk with honor, even with a cane." That moment was captured in a photo, framed in the podcast studio, etched into the Memorial Garden's wall, and remembered in every heart that had heard his story. Walter Granger was never a general, never a war hero by the usual measure, but he had become something rarer, a reminder that dignity does not demand a spotlight. It just needs someone willing to stand tall, cane in hand, and never back down from being seen. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.